Hi, everyone. This is Maddie Harper. I am going to be discussing the pandemic impact and recovery for IROs. Just a brief agenda of what we're going to cover today. I'll start off with a deep dive into IRO fundamentals. We looked at rents, occupancy, as well as retention rates. And then I will do a dive into supply and rent trends, as well as our supply and rent forecast for the year. So just starting off with IRO fundamentals, this is our market universe for investment strategy analysis. I will be referencing these throughout the presentation, so just wanted to make sure everyone had a clear picture of what I was referring to. For gateway markets, those are the 7 largest markets in the country. So it's San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., and Miami. The next tier of markets, or our second tier markets, are the established tech hubs. So it's places like Denver, Salt Lake City, Atlanta. And then finally, the third category is emerging tech hubs. So these are metros that are benefiting from migration into the cities and are growing rapidly, but have not reached that established tech hub phase yet. So we decided to look into our database and just look at specific IRO properties with 10 to 49 units and look at the change in occupancy on a year-over-year basis. So as you can see, the gateway markets have been most affected, with San Francisco, San Jose, Boston, and Manhattan falling near the bottom, with the largest declines in occupancy since April 2020. If you were to compare this to our other multifamily data, which is 50 units plus, you would see a lot of similar trends, but maybe more accelerated occupancy declines, especially in San Francisco and Manhattan. The good news is, as you will see in a few slides, the gateway markets have started their recovery, and we've seen occupancy as well as rents continue to slope up in all of these markets over the last few months. Looking at year-over-year rent growth, this is where it differs from larger multifamily a little bit. So we do still have Manhattan and San Francisco and even San Jose with the largest declines on a year-over-year basis. But interesting, which is opposite of what we're seeing with the 50 plus multifamily units, is rents in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Boston have actually done well for the IROs since April 2020. So that's kind of a change from what we've seen with the larger units. And that could be due to a number of factors. Probably the most likely is that there's little turnover with the IROs. So people are just sticking in their units, and the landlords or the owners of the property are then in turn able to raise rents. We also looked at the retention rates among the IRO properties. So San Francisco, Grand Rapids, and Seattle had the biggest change in the percentage of leases renewing. So they had a large decline in leases renewing, especially in San Francisco, where we saw almost a 30% decline in the percentage of leases renewed from April 2020 through April 2021. I spoke a little bit about a lot of people are leaving gateway markets, and that has in turn benefited a lot of suburban markets. These are just 2 examples, but if you were to look across the country, you would see a lot of examples where the urban market is hurting, and then the suburban markets surrounding that urban market have seen significant rent growth since March 2020. So just these 2 examples. The San Fernando Valley, which is right outside of LA. Since March 2020, we've seen almost an 8% increase in rents. Same thing in Bridgeport, New Haven, so right outside Manhattan. Rents did decline a little bit from February through April of this year, but since March 2020 are up almost 2.5%. And then, like I alluded to earlier, gateway markets have seen the most significant declines in occupancy, but have bounced back in the last few months. So most markets bottomed out in January or February and have seen occupancy begin to increase since then. On the rent side, most markets are recovering as well, with the exception of Washington, D.C., which has seen a decline in rents over the last 2 months. But we're expecting, as we head into the summer, more things begin to open up and some companies begin to call back their workers. We do expect occupancy and rents to continue to decline. Continue to increase. We're already seeing this in our larger multifamily data, so the 50 units plus, especially in Manhattan. Manhattan had an extremely strong month in May. And this could be due to the fact that a large concentration of workers in Manhattan are in the finance industry, and a lot of companies are beginning to call back these workers. And this is in contrast to a place like San Francisco, which is heavily concentrated with tech workers. And a lot of tech companies are kind of taking the opposite approach and are saying that you can work hybrid or you can work fully remote. So we aren't seeing that translate to an increase in rents just yet in San Francisco like we are in Manhattan. So switching gears a little bit and looking at supply and rent trends, and also our rent and supply forecasts. These forecasts are looking just at the 50 plus units, but it is helpful just to see kind of where we're going with supply, as well as rent forecasts in the metros that your IROs are in. We were seeing these migration corridors prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has only accelerated these trends that we've been seeing. So there has been an exodus out of California, people moving to lower cost cities like Denver, Phoenix, and Austin. And the same thing happening on the East Coast with people leaving New York and moving to lower cost places like North Carolina and Florida. These moves aren't just happening from gateway markets to tech hub markets. We're also seeing this movement just within the gateway market. So a lot of people are leaving the urban core of San Francisco or New York and just moving to a lower cost apartment in the suburbs, which is why we're seeing such strong rent increases in these suburban markets that surround the urban gateway markets. But there is one kind of bright spot here, that a lot of these moves, so a lot of people moved out of Manhattan but didn't go far. Same thing for San Francisco. So that does give the local downtowns hope that maybe once things start to fully reopen this summer and offices possibly reopen, some of these people who left will likely go back into the urban core and rent an apartment. Looking at where new supply is concentrated, it's in the places that you would expect. So it's these established tech hubs as well as emerging tech hubs like Boise. Miami also has a lot of supply, as well as Austin and Salt Lake City. These numbers might seem a little high, especially as a percentage of existing stock. But when you consider how many people are moving into each of these tech hubs every day, these units being delivered should have no problem being absorbed. We're forecasting tech hubs to have the highest amount of deliveries on an absolute basis, as well as a percentage of stock basis. So these bar lines represent the absolute number of deliveries that we are forecasting over the next 5 years. And then the percentage on the outside of the bar denotes the average annual growth as a percentage of stock. So while these bars might seem a little excessive, especially in Dallas, where we're projecting a lot of units to be delivered over the next 5 years. Looking at it as a percentage of stock, it doesn't seem that crazy or that out of line. And this is in line with what we've seen for absorption over the past few years, especially in Dallas and Austin. So we don't really foresee any problem with these units being absorbed. Some of the gateway markets do have slightly higher deliveries as a percentage of stock, especially in Miami. But again, Miami is one of those hot markets that we're seeing a lot of people move to right now. So these units being delivered should be able to be absorbed. We're forecasting tech hubs to have the most rent growth. So again, these hot markets that a lot of people are moving to, searching for lower cost apartments, places like Las Vegas, Boise, Phoenix, Atlanta. A lot of these markets have been strong throughout the pandemic and have fully recovered, and most of them are even past their pre-pandemic rent growth numbers. Gateway markets, on the other hand, are unsurprisingly forecasted to have the least amount of rent growth for the year end 2021. But as we move into 2022, we're forecasting a little bit higher rent growth in these markets, which should put most of these markets back to pre-pandemic levels, with the exception of maybe Manhattan, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, who could take a few more years to kind of get back to that rent growth where they were before the pandemic. One thing to keep in mind with these rent growth numbers is the amount of supply coming online. So I referenced it a little bit earlier, just on a metro level. This is looking on a national level. The amount of units we're projecting to be delivered over the next 6 years. And you can see most of this is concentrated in urban areas, which could hinder the recovery, especially for gateway markets. But this will taper down the amount of deliveries from 2023 to 2026. So as the amount of deliveries tapers down and the demand comes back to the gateway markets, rent growth will in turn recover. So just to summarize a little bit, gateway markets and urban cores were the worst hit amid the pandemic, but as you saw, a bottoming is emerging. Specifically for the IROs, we kind of saw a little bit of an opposite picture with San Francisco and Manhattan among the worst hit, but LA, Boston, and Chicago actually having strong rent growth throughout the last year. As more of the population gets vaccinated and things begin to open up, especially if there are people who just moved to a suburb, we could see those people return to the urban core and rent an apartment. One thing to keep in mind as these metros start the path to recovery is the amount of new supply that could hinder rent growth as we move forward. So just something to keep an eye on. Thank you all for taking the time to listen today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.